Congo looks, on paper, preposterous. Rwanda is tiny, home to 14 million people. The DRC is enormous and home to maybe 105 million people. As a military undertaking, it appears to make as much sense as Luxembourg attacking France. But it is happening. Rwanda invading the DRC, that is, not the Franco-Luxembourg War of 2025, at least not as of this broadcast. Earlier this week, Goma, the biggest city in the DRC's east, population perhaps 2 million, was seized by an alliance of rebel groups, of which the best equipped are M23, a barely disguised Rwandan proxy militia. Latest reports have the insurgents on the march towards Bukavu, another decent-sized Congolese city. One rebel commander, Corneille Nangaa, who has undertaken something of a career pivot since being director of the DRC's Electoral Commission, has declared an intention to lead his legions all the way to the capital, Kinshasa, as far by road from Goma as Dallas is from New York City, and Nangaa and his troops would be dealing with a lot more potholes. But it has been done before, sort of. During two colossal wars in the DRC around the turn of the 21st century, to which the outside world paid remarkably, if not scandalously, little attention, Rwandan-backed forces and or Rwandan allies toppled one Congolese regime, that of loopy tyrant Mobutu Sese Seko, and menaced another. The DRC's present government has described this latest Rwanda-sponsored incursion as a declaration of war. Why has Rwanda taken yet another pop at its mighty neighbour? Could this be the beginning of a third all-in regional conflict within the DRC? And why is this cycle of conflict so persistent? This is the Foreign Desk.
Kinshasa may be their target, but the region may be completely destabilized if that conflict escalates. And I think that should be a concern from many other governments in the region.
And so what you have is both sides, actually, people invested in the persistence of conflicts and with no interest in bringing an end to these cycles of violence that have persisted since 1996.
Just think about what the message that we've put out here in the West for the last 3 years. We have consistently praised Kagame, admired him. Is there any surprise that he just sort of thought, I can do what I want now?
You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andew Mueller. Our first guest is Fred Bauma, Executive Director of the Kinshasa-based Research Institute Ebotele and Senior Fellow at New York University's Center of International Cooperation. Fred joins us from Kinshasa. Fred, first of all, Goma, the center of this week's events, is the city in which you were born and raised. What sense have you been able to get of what is happening there?
Well, yes, I was born and raised in Goma. My family is still living there. In the last week, Goma has been under attack by M23 rebels supported by Rwanda. Since the beginning of this week, what we are hearing is that a large part of the city of Goma has been effectively controlled by M23 troops. The airport is under their control, the border, the radio, and another part of the city. There are images that we start seeing from Goma with a lot of dead bodies in the streets. The clashes between the army and the M23 has caused many deaths in the city.
And in Kinshasa, which is obviously an extremely long way away from Goma, the Democratic Republic of Congo is an absolutely enormous country. There have been reports of various attacks on embassies, but that aside, is there any real concern about the prospect of this war coming to Kinshasa?
Well, what we need to understand is that in the Congolese history, every time Rwanda is involved in a conflict, it brings a lot of emotions. It reminds people the history of the last 30 years of violence, mostly supported by Rwanda or Burundi. And so there is a strong perception here in the population that the M23, which is also supported by Rwanda, has been able to control those areas because of the a lack of actions from the international community. So every time M23 move and sees large city, the public, and sometimes instigated or not, tend to go demonstrate or attack Western embassies, mostly because they believe some Western countries are supporters of Kigali's regime.
Mm-hmm.
So that explains why they choose France, for example, or the US or the UK and other Western countries. So it's a subject that people discuss in the streets, most in many places where you can go in Kinshasa. Now, are they really understanding what is happening in the ground with precision? I think that is debatable. No, there's not a lot of information, like a lot of accurate information going on in the Congolese media in Kinshasa. The Congolese government have been trying to limit to the maximum who is able to speak of what is happening in the East and what people hear. So even in the context of Goma, I've been around the city, and you hear people questioning whether or not M23 are in Goma. Like, this is almost 3 days since they've been seizing and cleaning, to use their term, the city. So the people are concerned. I won't say people in Kinshasa are not concerned, but I think also most of time the level of information that they get is very limited.
How equipped is the Congolese state to deal with a threat like the one posed by M23 and various other rebel groups? I mean, in the last decade or so in particular, has it become more like an actually functional state that is able to govern the entire country, or not?
I mean, the situation now is very different from where we were 20 years ago, with the country completely divided in many armed groups. The country was relatively well unified. We had a lot of armed groups, mostly in eastern part of DRC. The current government has invested a lot of resources in the army. The question is how effective those investments have been made. The budget of the army went from something like 400 million to 2 billion. I mean, I know from the UK perspective, it's still very little, but from the Congolese budget perspective, it's a lot of money. And yet, on the ground, the results are still to be. We haven't seen much of the capacity of the army to react. So there is a question of the effectiveness of security policies that the current government has chosen. And clearly, the Congolese army is facing a lot of limitations. Now, it's also true to say that in this particular conflict, the Congolese army is not only facing a small armed group, like there are hundreds. It is by UN reports and other reports, the Congolese army is facing a well-organized army. In fact, the support by Rwanda is very significant in explaining the progress of M23. There is increasing use of military technology, and that has limited significantly the capacity of the army to intervene, especially with Air Force support. So yes, the Congolese government has invested in the security. He had been trying to rebuild or to constitute a strong army. Those measures has not been successful to what we see. The Congolese government used also military mercenaries, if we can call them by their name, and that has been very questionable and not effective. But also this is also due to the support that M23 is receiving from Rwanda.
You mentioned earlier that suspicion that many Congolese people have of the way that outside powers are involved here. And I guess certainly given Congo's history, being suspicious of what European powers are up to in Congo is a reasonable perspective to have. But we have seen France's Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot in Kinshasa and Kigali this week. Is there any role that an outside power, perhaps like France, could play here that would be acceptable, do you think, to Congolese people?
I mean, there is a lot of influence than France and in UK and the US may have on this situation. From the Congolese people perspective, the discourse of these countries, and the UK is now starting to call out Rwanda officially, the discourse of this country is in contradiction with some of their actions. Like France has been strongly calling out Rwanda for a long time now. At the same time, the perception here is that France is supporting Rwanda because of Rwanda involvement in Mozambique, where French interests are, or the UK with the immigrant deal. So there is a limitation in dealing with Rwanda only by discourse. Unless there is clear actions, unless this war, this conflict starts touching core interests of Rwanda in terms of reputation and in terms of resources, it will be unlikely to get to any result just by pointing out strong statement.
We have heard a somewhat vainglorious sounding statement from one rebel commander. This is Corneille Nangaa, who I think may have some sort of personal grudge with Congo's current president, that he intends to march his troops all the way to Kinshasa, which is obviously a very long way from Goma. Do people in Kinshasa take that prospect seriously, that the Congolese government could be toppled as a consequence of what we've seen this week?
I mean, I won't say they are taking it very seriously, but I would say this conflict reminds, at least the way it's progressing, reminds us another war in 1996, 1997. So even if they're still very far, and I don't think they will reach Kinshasa tomorrow, but it may start destabilizing people and creating doubt on people. And Nangaa knows what he's doing, I should say. But I think in the very regional thing is that this conflict has the potential to becoming a regional conflict around Eastern Congo. As you know, Burundi is involved, Uganda is somehow. So Kinshasa may be their target, but the region may be completely destabilized if that conflict escalates. And I think that should be a concern from many other governments in the region.
Just one final question, because you've mentioned a couple of times that this is reminding people a bit of previous wars in Congo, and these were absolutely colossal conflicts, which we will be discussing in greater depth later in the show, but they attracted very, very little coverage, certainly in Western media when they were happening. They did not attract actually much interest of many Western governments while they were occurring. Is that a source of frustration and resentment among Congolese, that you had these colossal conflicts involving many countries, dozens of rebel groups, which killed millions and displaced tens of millions, and as far as much of the rest of the world was concerned, it might not have been happening at all?
Yeah, of course, this is a big source of frustration from people here, especially because people in DRC perceive the influence of the country, whether it's realistic or not, as a country that has provided resources to technological progress at a different moment in the history. And I think that is also what's explained why the popular opinion tend to turn against Western embassies rather than other embassies every time there is conflict. There is a feeling that the war benefits to other country or the resources of DRC benefit to other countries, but they don't care enough when it comes to trying to resolve the conflict in the country.
Fred Bauma, Executive Director of the Kinshasa-based research institute Ebuteli, thank you for joining us. This is The Foreign Desk. You're listening to The Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. Our next guest is Jason Stearns, founder and chair of the Advisory Board for Congo Research Group and author most recently of The War That Doesn't Say Its Name, The Unending Conflict in the Congo. And Jason, with the subtitle of that book in mind, does what we're looking at right now strike you as any kind of extension or echo of those first two Congo wars from 96 to 2003?
Well, yes, absolutely. I think what we see now is exactly that. We see two parties, especially the Rwandans and the Congolese, the Rwandan government and the Congolese government, who have no intention really of ending this conflict. I mean, the most recent escalation obviously was sparked by Rwanda, that has invaded the Eastern DRC for the 5th time now since 1996. And it seems intent once again in projecting power and influence into the Eastern Congo by backing an armed group. And so they triggered this. But I think the reaction of the Congolese government is also striking. The Congolese government sees the Eastern Congo, I mean, the Eastern Congo where this is happening is 1,500 kilometers away, 2,000 kilometers away from the capital. It's very far away. And the way the government sees this in Kinshasa is there's actually no threat for them toppling the government. What we're going to do is get rid of our pesky army, send them far to the east, let them deal with this situation. But at the same time, that army in itself, because it's not held accountable as transparent, it gets really invested in the conflict. And so what you have is both sides, actually people invested in the persistence of conflicts and with no interest in bringing an end to these cycles of violence that have persisted since 1996.
Well, I do want to go back to that conflict of the mid-90s to the early 2000s, because it did occur more or less under the radar of most of the media. You were an honourable exception to that, but it was properly enormous. How would you go about describing the scale of it?
Well, the conflict in 1996 involved 9 different African armies. It probably killed something on the order of, well, millions of people. I mean, the problem with casualties in the Congo is that they're very difficult to measure. From what we know, probably 6 million people died of the conflict, but most of them died of the humanitarian consequences of the conflict. But it was devastating, absolutely devastating. And it took place on a vast battlefield. The Congo is as large as all of Western Europe put together, from Spain to Sweden. All of Western Europe is the size of the Congo. So it's a vast battlefield, 9 different armies, and enormous humanitarian consequences. That's the first and really the second Congo War as well.
I mean, is it fair to characterize those wars as principally a resources grab, or were other factors in play?
No, I think that it's about power in the region and who has power in the region. So I think resources play into that, but resources themselves are not power. They're just a means to power. And so I think that the primary impulse that started the war was the fact that Mobutu, who had run his country into the ground over 32 years of misrule, was backing all kinds of different rebel groups from neighboring countries. And all of those neighboring countries, Angola, Rwanda, Uganda, Burundi, wanted to get rid of him because of that. And so the Rwandans took the lead because they had the biggest quarrel to pick with Mobutu, because Mobutu was backing the people who had carried out the genocide in Rwanda in 1994. And so they led the charge, but 9 different African armies joined him to topple Mobutu. So that was really about power, security, geopolitics as everywhere in the world. Really now, however, as the war went on, the war became expensive, it became costly, and these occupying armies came to realize that great profits were to be made in the Congo. And so over time, the grand ideologies of liberation faded. And by the time we were in the Second Congo War, which lasted from 1998 to 2003, really opportunism took hold, most of the actors, and the sort of massive extraction of resources became a dominating feature of all of those involved, including the Congolese government.
Was it clear to you at the time why there wasn't more interest taken either by Western media or indeed Western governments? Did both media and governments alike take a look at it and just think, God, that looks really complicated and unpleasant, and I don't want to get involved in that?
Yeah, and not a whole lot has changed. I mean, it's just, I get so many calls from journalists who say, can you, the first thing you say is, we know this is really complicated, but can you boil it down? Because it's the bane of their existence. I mean, there's 100 armed groups in the Eastern Congo. How on earth are you supposed to distill the essence of this conflict in a 300 or 400 word article for a newspaper or in a 2-minute segment? It's a conflict that's far away, that we don't understand, that's extremely complex, that's the edge of the periphery of everybody's vision. And I think that really explains enormous amount. I mean, it is in Africa. The striking thing is that This is the total opposite. It's like the mirror image of how Congolese perceive outside involvement. Because for Congolese, outsiders have determined their fate. Foreigners assassinated the first prime minister 6 months after he took office in 1960.
This is Patrice Lumumba.
Patrice Lumumba was assassinated with the complicity of the CIA, the MI6, and the Belgian Foreign Service as well. Mobutu Sese Seko, who then followed and ruled the country for 32 years, was a frequent visitor to the White House. It's easy to see how Congolese perceive that the whole world cares about them because their fate has been determined by outsiders. And when I tell them that actually, most Americans couldn't find the Congo on a map, and President Biden did not get his Congo briefing with his croissants every morning, they look at you bewildered because surely this cannot be true, because what they see is completely different to that. So the problem is there's this huge disparity between how important outsiders are in the Congo and how much anybody outside actually knows about the Congo and pays attention. And that allows thugs really to get away with murder in the Congo. You have individuals, small companies or small officials within a government or administration who play these oversized role in the Congo wars. And that's the case until today.
But does it strike you that greater involvement, greater interest from outside powers might potentially make things any better for Congo and the Congolese? If tomorrow morning, if someone of the caliber and power of, I don't know, President Donald Trump, President Xi Jinping, the combined forces of the European Union decide we're going to get into this and we're going to try to fix it, would that actually help?
I shudder to think what would happen if Donald Trump really invests in trying to. One thing I've been hearing recently is, well, we need to get the Americans interested because only if Americans are really interested can we get the Rwandans out of this, because the Rwandans are really playing the major spoiler role at the moment. Well, Trump is a transactional president. How do you get him interested? China, right? There's a good reason to be interested in the Congo if you're Donald Trump. The largest producer of copper in Africa, the largest producer of cobalt, which you need in most electric vehicles, a huge producer of gold, you name it. The uranium that blew up Hiroshima and Nagasaki came from the Congo. It's a massive producer of all of these things. But I'm very reluctant to make that argument, because if you go down that path, and he does really get interested in the Congo, it could go terribly wrong as well. I think there needs to be some sort of a commensurate involvement based on how much money you give. So let's say, for example, now, Rwanda and the DRC are dramatically influenced by outsiders, and yet we know nothing about that. That discrepancy is not a good thing. So I do think there should be more attention. But I think that in the end of the day, the Congo is only going to get fixed by the Congolese, and the outsider's role can only be to midwife that process. So if you want to be constructive, if you really want to play, express solidarity towards the Congolese, that's not telling them what to do. That's not being the domineering role in the region. That's by creating space that will allow them to determine their own destiny. That's the opposite of what we've done so far.
But that does prompt the question, just finally, and at the very real risk of sounding like white people drawing lines on a map of Africa, which has always just gone tremendously well, is the Democratic Republic of Congo actually a viable entity, this absolutely enormous, incredibly diverse, very, very geographically difficult country? Is it asking too much of anybody to try and get all that under some sort of control?
Well, that's a question to ask the Congolese. Over and over again, the Congolese overwhelmingly have, if one thing the Belgians and especially Mobutu created in the Congo was a sense of national pride. Mm-hmm. There's an enormous sense of national pride. And the problem is not so much that, people in the different regions in the South or in the East would mind having their own country. But for many of them, the fragmentation, or what they call balkanization of the Congo, is just really a euphemism for being dominated by a neighboring country. And so if you say, let the east of the DRC secede, what most people in the eastern DRC will hear is, let Rwanda dominate us. And then in the south, it's the same thing. So I think first and foremost, the Congolese should be able to decide this question. And I think most Congolese, certainly all the ones I speak to, do not think that's a solution for their ills. And secondly, I think that we need to know what we're talking about when we're talking about secession. Is it really secession, or is it being dominated by somebody else?
That was Jason Stearns, author most recently of The War That Doesn't Say Its Name. This is The Foreign Desk. This is the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. The key figure in the current Congolese crisis is Rwanda's president, Paul Kagame, who has effectively or actually ruled his country just short of 30 years since taking power in the aftermath of the 1994 genocide. Kagame orchestrated his first incursion into the DRC in 1996 in pursuit of exiled Hutu militants who had helped commit the slaughter of Kagame's fellow Tutsis and, in the name, he says, of Rwanda's security, has maintained pressure on the DRC ever since. But what does Kagame want now? Joining me finally is Michela Wrong, a journalist specialising in Western, Central and Eastern Africa and author of several books about Africa, including the recent Rwanda-focused Do Not Disturb, the story of a political murder and an African regime gone bad. Michela, if we were to ask President Kagame what the relationship is between Rwanda and the M23 rebels, what would he tell us?
Oh, he would say what he's been saying for a very long time, which is the M23 is a Congolese rebel group and Congo's problem, and it's nothing to do with him. He has occasionally, though, partnered those statements with declarations that the Congolese Tutsi population is in danger. It is threatened with extermination by the FDLR, which is a group of Hutu extremists who fled into Congo after the genocide in Rwanda. And he would make it clear that the M23 are protecting those people. And so he is sympathetic to their aims. But I don't think he has ever admitted that Rwanda is supporting the M23.
I mean, this is not the only place in the world where we see or have seen a model of this sort. It's the semi-deniable proxy army, but there actually is a relationship, isn't there?
Oh, yes. We've seen particular detail produced by the group of experts who work for the UN, who survey the area, monitor the area, look at what's going on, and they've produced a series of reports with more and more detail in those reports about how the M23 is being equipped, given uniforms, given up-to-date weaponry, and also the fact that it's not just M23. Rwandan troops, real Rwandan troops, official Rwandan troops have been moving into Congo in ever greater numbers, and that the M23 also seems to be following Rwandan orders or directions because they're moving around strategically and tactically in a way that is recognizably that of a classical African army.
I mean, is it clear to you what this particular incursion is trying to accomplish? Because it's very much not the first time that Rwandan or Rwandan-backed forces have gone over the border in the last 30 years. Does this strike you as anything significantly different to what we've seen before?
Well, you're quite right. I mean, back in 2012, we had a similar situation in which Goma was surrounded and briefly occupied by the M23. And of course, way back in the 1990s, and in 96, 97, we saw a Rwandan group, a militia group being supported by Rwanda, which invaded Congo and then marched all the way to Kinshasa and toppled President Mobutu. And I think ever since then, what you have seen is a series of rebel groups who are usually made up of members of the Tutsi ethnic group, who really often have far more loyalty towards Rwanda than they do to Congo, challenging the Congolese authorities and carving out, at regular intervals, carving out their own territory. And I think there's been a lot of uncertainty as to how far Kagame wants to go, President Paul Kagame, how far he wants to go this time, because this has happened so many times, and what was the agenda? And increasingly, I think people have gone from thinking that he just wanted sort of to shake Congo's cage and make sure that he was taken into account on a series of infrastructural deals that Congo was discussing with Uganda and Burundi. And I think now there's a very different view. I mean, it's been changing by the day, that this is de facto annexation by the M23 of first North Kivu and then South Kivu, I mean, because they're now marching on Bukavu, and that really Kagame is repeating what he did in 1998, when he had a puppet administration in place in Eastern Congo, which allowed him to kind of hoover up these incredible mineral riches that this area produces.
Well, I mean, that is, I suspect, more than a partial answer to my next question, but it is, if we think Kagame does have meaningful territorial ambitions in the DRC, what is behind that? Is it just that Rwanda is really small and the DRC is absolutely enormous, or are there specific things that Kagame wants in specific parts of the DRC?
Well, he's definitely already been benefiting from Congo's mineral resources. I mean, the UN and various diplomats can produce statistics showing just how the enormous amount of coltan that is being hoovered out via Rwanda from Congo, in particular from this mine called Rubaya. And of course, coltan is what we need for our phones, to make our laptops, to make our EV vehicle batteries. And it's an incredibly profitable thing to be able to export. So he's already been benefiting from years of that. But there's also gold. Rwanda has become a massive exporter of gold, yet no one can really point to where this gold supposedly comes from in Rwanda, because it's actually Congolese gold. There's tin, and that's not the only, minerals aren't the only issue at stake, because of course Kivu famously was the breadbasket of the Congo. It supports a lot of agriculture, a lot of cattle. It used to be where quinine was grown in great plantations. So it's a very desirable strip of land. And it seems that Kagame now wants to have a sort of permanent hold on it, having sort of interfered in it since the late 1990s.
But if we're looking at this situation as President Kagame may be looking at this situation, for all the mineral resources and associated wealth that he may be able to get hold of, is there not a danger that this comes back to bite him? Because the whole thing he has tried to do in the last 30 years is turn Rwanda into this island of business-friendly stability in the heart of Africa. And if he comes to be seen, or to end up depicting himself as another warlord almost in the Vladimir Putin mold, that's not going to help, is it?
Well, you might think so, but just think about what the message that we've put out here in the West for the last 3 years, since the M23 went back into action in a big way. The Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting was staged on Rwandan soil. We've seen, Rwanda sponsoring all these sexy European football groups, football teams, including Arsenal, Paris Saint-Germain, Bayern Munich. We're seeing talk of the Formula One being staged in Rwanda. There's almost never a day that doesn't go by in which Kagame doesn't tread a red carpet. And this constant talking up of this development model, this economic miracle. A lot of this talk, by the way, being hyped. The statistics are nothing like as impressive as people make out. I mean, we have consistently praised him, admired him here in the West. Is there any surprise that he just sort of thought, I can do what I want now, and I can take a strip of Eastern Congo because I quite fancy that?
I mean, just to bring all that together then, is he proceeding on the assumption that he can do as he pleases because he well understands that the Western world has decided that, say whatever else you will about Paul Kagame, and you might well have reason to make any number of criticisms of President Kagame, but they would rather have him there than any of the plausible alternatives?
Well, he's been incredibly skilled at making himself useful. So you see him sending troops to Mozambique to protect France's Total installation there that was being threatened by a jihadi group. You see him stepping up and offering for Rwanda to have all our wanted British asylum seekers dumped in Central Africa. He was game for that. Other African readers weren't. And so he knows that he's made himself extremely useful. And that, to a certain extent, has bought the silence of the West. And what I'm seeing is a sort of stunningly limp response. There was a UN Security Council emergency meeting on Sunday where almost every delegate, I think apart from Russia and obviously Rwanda, were denouncing Kigali's support for the M23 and telling the M23 to stop. And the language was quite strong, quite forceful. And since then, what has happened? I mean, we've seen Germany saying that it's suspending talks over aid with Rwanda, but all we've seen otherwise has been strong language. And, the time, Goma has now fallen. The time for sanctions is now. In fact, it was yesterday. In fact, many people would say it was several years ago. And we're not really seeing a terribly forceful reaction. So I think Kagame who is very adept at reading the signals from the international community, will be thinking, oh, I've got away with it yet again. M23 are marching towards Bukavu. That will be the next to fall.
Michela Wrong, author of Do Not Disturb, the story of a political murder and an African regime gone bad. Thank you for joining us. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota and Lily Austin. Lily also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com, and don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and to our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andew Mueller, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.